Hello again, everyone. Welcome back to the October 2024 edition of Milwaukee Baseball. I'm your host, Robert Cadera. Well, first things first, we begin today's show with congratulations. Congratulations to the 2024 Milwaukee Brewers, who became the first team to win a divisional crown this season and advanced to the MLB playoffs. Hats off to manager Pat Murphy, GM Matt Arnold, and all the players for such a terrific season. They led the National League Central wire to wire through a slew of injuries to key players, but they never faltered. In the wild card round, the Mets and Brewers are currently tied with one win each. Tonight's game will determine which of the teams moves on to face the Philadelphia Phillies in the NLDS round of the 2024 postseason. The Mets are going to be throwing veteran Jose Quintana against the Brewers' rookie Tobias Myers. It's been a great back and forth series thus far, and Quintana has been brilliant for the Mets lately. But the Brewers have been getting great contributions from Jackson Chourio, who hit 2 home runs last night, and the likes of Garrett Mitchell, who stroked yesterday's 2-run game-winning blast. Now, if the middle of the Brewers' order starts hitting, I'd say the crew has a better than even chance of advancing. The postseason this year has really been full of surprises. After all, who expected the Tigers or the Royals to advance in the American League? With every other series already concluded, the entire baseball world will be focused on tonight's game. I know I'm going to be watching from the opening pitch to the very last out, and I expect a really good game. I'd like to provide some historical context to today's game with a bit of reminiscing. Many fans today, even those in the Milwaukee area, may not fully understand what the arrival of the Milwaukee Braves in 1953 meant to this city and really to all of Wisconsin. I'd like to share some of my memories with you, and please forgive me for any inaccuracies. I was just a kid way back then. In the winter of 1953, when I was 4 years old, my Uncle Phil used to take me out to a construction site to watch the progress on a large county building project. I didn't know it at the time, but what I was watching was the construction of Milwaukee County Stadium. I didn't know what a baseball stadium was, as I had not yet been introduced to the sport. That, of course, would come in the year ahead. My uncle and my mother had an interest in the construction, as their brother, my Uncle Willard, was the Milwaukee County engineer, and it was his job to supervise the construction, bring the project in on time. I didn't really understand their excitement as the mammoth facility grew and took shape, becoming larger each time I was taken to see it. A couple of months later, on Saturday, April 13th, 1953, I was outside playing in the sandbox and hoping it wouldn't rain. My mother appeared at the back door of our house and called out to me to come on inside. There was something on the television that she wanted me to see. Well, this was something new. I didn't recall ever being told to stop playing outside and come in to watch television, but in I went. My parents, my Uncle Phil, and my grandmother were huddled around our old Capehart black and white television set. And there on the screen, I could see that a train had pulled into a station. People stood all around on the platform, and they were applauding while men carrying suitcases climbed down off the train and began mingling with the crowd. I remember seeing a rather ordinary-looking balding man wearing a heavy winter coat, go down the steps, dragging his suitcase behind him. My mother got all excited, and she exclaimed, "That's the great Warren Spahn." The rest of that morning had us watching this spectacle until all the men had gotten off that train. The Milwaukee Braves were home to stay, or so we thought at that time. For the next near decade, a part of my life revolved around that team. For someone who wasn't there at the time, I suspect it must be hard to imagine what Milwaukee in the 1950s and early 1960s was like, and not just during the baseball season, but the off season as well. It was kind of like living in an intimate minor league city, but having the major leagues right in our midst. Even though I was only in grammar school, I met so many of the Braves in person. Carl Sawatsky lived for a while next door to my cousins, and I played pickup ball with Carl's son, John Paul. Greg Spahn, Warren's son, was in our little league, and as I recall, he didn't want to pitch. He preferred to play shortstop. I saw Ray Crone nearly every Sunday during the season at Mass at St. Bernard's Church. Henry Aaron was on my cousin Phil's paper route. I went sledding one winter day with Gene Conley and his kids. Johnny Logan spoke at one of the communion breakfasts at our church. It really was not at all unusual in those days to run into one of the Braves at any time, anywhere in town. Sometimes this could have unintended consequences. Like, for example, the day some of my friends and I were bicycling to Hawthorne Glen. They had a real baseball diamond there with a mound, a backstop, and everything. We'd go there on occasion to play ball and feel a little bit more like big leaguers. On the street that led from Milwaukee Avenue south to Hawthorne Glen, there was a red brick duplex on the west side of the street that was very special to us, because that's where Warren Spahn and Lou Burdett lived during the season. Needless to say, our bikes seemed to slow down all by themselves when we passed that way on our trip to the ball diamond. One morning, as we headed to Hawthorne Glen, the drapes in Warren Spahn's front bay window were open wide. The sun poured in from the east, and there, right there, was the great Warren Spahn, vacuuming the living room rug in his underwear. Well, the extent to which that traumatized me can, I guess, be seen in the fact that I remember that experience so vividly nearly 70 years later. Talk about seeing a myth crumble right in front of your eyes. I fought through that incident, however, and for the rest of my childhood into my teens, I saw Spahny work his magic right out there on the mound. That was really what mattered. It was all part of growing up in the baseball mania that held Milwaukee in its grip back in those years. I'll have more stories to share with you about those days in future shows. Right now, I'd like to profile one of those original Braves that most people have no recollection of. Maybe they never even heard of him. Everybody knows about Warren Spahn, Henry Aaron, Eddie Matthews, Lou Burdett, Del Crandall, Joe Adcock, Billy Bruton, all those stars on the great Braves teams of the 1950s. No, today we're going to celebrate an original Milwaukee Brave, someone most fans have either never heard of or have long since forgotten. This Brave infielder was not one of those nameless 1950s decade bonus babies. In fact, His roots with the Braves go all the way back to the 1939 season in Boston. He was a 19-year-old rookie that year, and he hit .228. Not much, but the next year he was the Braves' regular third baseman, and he hit .251 and .259 the following year. In 1943, he entered military service and served 3 years duty on the Coast Guard. And when he got out, the Braves organization sent him back to the minors, but he proved them wrong by hitting .343 and terrorizing pitching in the American Association. By the end of that year, 1946, he was back up in Boston, and he remained a Brave for the next 9 seasons. I'm talking, of course, about infielder Sebastian Sibbi Sisti. The unheralded Sibbi Sisti is the subject of our Milwaukee Braves profile this month. Sibbi Sisti may have had a rather unremarkable major league career, but he lived a rather remarkable life in many ways. And Sisti, a baseball player and off-season truck driver, personified the Braves' working-class demeanor, perhaps more than any other player on the squad. Sibbi got his first big league tryout at age 15 and was eventually signed by the same scout, a guy named Bill Myers, who also signed another guy from Buffalo named Warren Spahn. The most interesting event during Sisti's high school years took place just before his senior year at Canisius High School, where he had been the big star of the football team for 3 years. Unbeknownst to Sibbi, his father signed an agreement with the Boston Braves scout Myers, essentially committing Sisti to play for the Braves' Class A team in Hartford, Connecticut, just as soon as Sibbi graduated from Canisius in the spring of 1938. So, to the consternation of the Canisius football coach and the principal, Sibbi could not play football for his senior year. But surprisingly, the Braves' contract did allow him to star in both basketball and in baseball that year. That first season of pro ball, Sisti hit a solid .293 as a 17-year-old shortstop. And that winter, he was invited to the Boston Braves big league spring training camp the following spring, after which he was sent back to Hartford at the start of the season to learn to play second base. He was hitting .312 there when the Braves shortstop Eddie Miller broke his ankle. The Braves quickly summoned Sibbi back, and he found himself as the Braves' new regular shortstop. At that time, still 18 years of age, he was the youngest player in the major leagues. Now, over the next 3 seasons, Sibbi was a regular in the Braves infield, playing not only shortstop, but second and third base. And in the 1941 offseason, Sibbi got married to his lifelong sweetheart and wife, Noreen Barone. The future was looking bright. But a little something called World War II intervened, and for the next 3 years, Sibbi Sisti served in the U.S. Coast Guard. Upon his return, Sibbi was furious that the Braves again sent him back down to the minor leagues in 1946. He destroyed AAA pitching, hitting a resounding .343 and earning a return to the big leagues for good in 1947. It was in that year of 1947 that Sibbi suffered a major shoulder injury that affected the course of his career, tearing 3 ligaments in his shoulder. This was but the first of a series of injuries he suffered, but it was severe. Sibbi needed to have muscle grafts from his left leg taken to strengthen his shoulder. The procedure alone required 44 stitches. In fact, after that, Boston sports writer Al Hirschberg started calling Sibbi the embroidered man. Sibbi carried the scars from over 75 stitches on his body from all the injuries he suffered while playing for the Braves, both in Boston and then later in Milwaukee. For the rest of his career, Sibbi Sisti became the quintessential utility infielder, and by the time the Braves moved to Milwaukee in 1953, Sibbi was kind of hanging on to his big league roster spot by a thread. In that first wonderful year of the Milwaukee Braves in 1953, Sibbi Sisti was the 25th man on the 25-man roster. He only came to the plate 28 times all year. He got 3 hits, worked 5 walks. The next year, 1954, he was on the roster almost the entire season and never got a single at bat. He scored 2 runs as he was often used as a pinch runner, and that was it. Before the 1954 season ended, Sibbi was asked by the Braves organization to accept the position as a player manager of the Milwaukee farm team in Quebec. And for several years, he managed at various levels in the Braves and then later the Philadelphia Philly organizations before ringing down the curtain as a coach with the 1969 Seattle Pilots. Ironically, he retired from baseball at the end of that 1969 season, just in time to miss coming back to Milwaukee as a coach for the relocating Seattle Pilots, who became the Milwaukee Brewers. As Sisti said, it was time to return home and get back to my real job as a truck driver. Well, I had the pleasure of meeting and talking with Sibbi Sisti in Buffalo back in the 1990s, and I told him that I remembered him from his days as a Milwaukee Brave. He looked at me rather astonished and said, "How? I never got on the field." When I asked what it must have been like to be part of that baseball frenzy in my hometown, he smiled at me and he said, "Nobody realized it at the time, but I had the best year of any of the 1953 Braves." Well, I asked him how could that be when he only went 3 for 25 for the entire season. And this is what he said. "It was like this. Milwaukee showered the Braves with all kinds of gifts and kindnesses, free milk, free groceries, free gasoline, free cars, free diaper service, and I had 5 kids to feed. I got way more in perks than I did from my Braves salary of less than 10 grand. As I learned that day, Sibbi was a hard man to argue with. He then went on to tell me that he was a Hall of Famer. I must have looked pretty puzzled. He smiled and said, "It's true. I'm in the Boston Braves Hall of Fame, the Buffalo Hall of Fame, the Canisius High School Hall of Fame, and the Greater Buffalo Sports Hall of Fame." And he added, "I was also a movie star." "A movie star?" I asked. "Did you ever see The Natural?" he said. "I was a technical advisor to director Barry Levinson on that film. They shot the whole movie right here in Buffalo. And I helped Robert Redford and all the other actors who were playing ball players, showing them how they should move and look and carry themselves. They even gave me a bit part in the movie." Well, Sibbi was right. He played the manager of the team playing against Redford's team. And in one of the film's climactic scenes, Sibbi walks out to the mound and he calls in a young fireballing relief pitcher to face Redford's character, Roy Hobbs. Of course, in the movie, Hobbs hits a mammoth home run that crashes into the outfield light tower and shatters it and wins the pennant. Sisti made an oft-told promise after seeing the movie. He said, "If they ever do make The Natural 2 as a sequel, I'm going back out on that mound again. This time, on the next pitch, Redford's going right down on his ass. Sibbi Sisti made a lot of people laugh. The only tears he evoked came on April 24th, 2006, when Sibbi passed away in Amherst, New York, at the age of 85. One final note. Some of you may have come across a classic baseball book called The Great American Baseball Card Flipping, Trading, and Bubblegum Book. It has a whole page full of Sibbi's baseball cards with an epitaph underneath that says, "Good night, Sibbi Sisti, wherever you are." I suppose they put that in thinking that nobody would know the guy they were talking about. Well, now you know who Sibbi Sisti was. A Boston Brave, a Milwaukee Brave, and almost the Milwaukee Brewers coach in 1969. But he was also, and most of all, a really great guy. That about wraps things up for the October edition of Milwaukee Baseball. I hope you enjoyed the show today, and we'll come back the first week in November for our next podcast. I'm your host, Robert Cadera. Thank you so much for stopping by. I hope to see you on our next trip around the bases.